Good afternoon, and welcome to the Microsoft Middle East and Africa Forum for Sustainability Leaders. In this podcast series, we facilitate knowledge exchange with critical voices tasked with leading the region's drive toward net zero. Today, we're looking at how the Middle East and Africa can become a global clean hydrogen hub and the opportunities and challenges that surround that endeavor. We'll explore how stakeholders can maintain the momentum on the road towards sustainability and what lies ahead for moving the needle towards a functioning clean economy in the region. I'm happy to welcome today's guests and hear their insights and perspectives. We have with us today Francois Dao, Senior Vice President of Middle East and Africa for EDF Renewables, Dr. Faras Al-Abdouani, Acting Managing Director at Hydrom, Cornelius Mattis, Chief Executive Officer at DII Desert Energy, Martin Lambert, Senior Research Fellow and Head of Hydrogen Research at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, and our host, Mohammed Hassan, Industry Director of Energy and Sustainability for the Middle East, Africa, and Turkey at Microsoft. Thank you all for being with us here today. And I'd like to start off by inviting our guests to make some opening statements on this question. And Mohammed, let's kick it off with you. I welcome your thoughts on the theme of today's discussion.
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you everyone for joining, and welcome to Microsoft podcast. As everyone is aware, right, climate change is one of the most pressing issues of our time. And as the world becomes increasingly aware of its negative impact on our daily lives, the need for clean energy solution is more pressing than ever. And in the recent 2-3 years, hydrogen has emerged as the promising solution that can help us decarbonize the global economy and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. The Middle East and Africa region, with its abundant natural resources, its proximity to the European and Western market, has the potential to become a leading producer and exporter of clean hydrogen. However, realizing this potential will require a concerted effort from all stakeholders. Today, in our podcast with our esteemed guests, we will explore the opportunities and challenges that come with building a clean hydrogen hub in the Middle East and Africa. We will discuss the technology, policy, and investment needed to make this vision a reality. We will also explore the potential economic and environmental benefits of a clean hydrogen hub in the region. By working together, I believe we can unlock the immense potential of clean hydrogen and create a sustainable future for generations to come. Thank you very much. And, with that intro, I hand it back over to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Mohammed. And Francois, let's take it over to you. As Mohammed was saying, different stakeholders are involved. And over the past year, there's been a lot of talk about competing priorities when it comes to energy transition versus energy security versus energy sustainability. And this list of priorities shifts over time, and the list it changes depends on who you're talking to. I'm curious what role you see the green hydrogen sector playing in the energy transition in the Middle East and Africa, and how you envision it fitting into the overall energy mix in this region.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me for this conversation. Allow me just to give a word about EDF itself, and then I think it's part of the answer. EDF is a French utilities company. It's 120 gigawatt net power installed capacity around the world, and 520 terawatt hour, which is quite big, of course, in terms of production. And if there's one figure to allow me to pass is that 2021, not long ago, for the full year, 91% of our electricity was net zero carbon. So we are world leader in free carbon electricity, and the purpose of company is very simple, is to build a future energy net zero with electricity, of course, and innovative solutions. So yes, for Middle East and Africa, we are have a strong presence or assets in in the region, with about 4.8 gigawatt of renewable energies, meaning solar and wind mainly, and a bit of battery as storage. Yes, we want this mix to increase, we have no doubt that net zero carbon is possible by 2050, as committed in several countries like UAE and Oman. Yes, it evolved, very important. And of course, and we will, I'm sure, talk about it, is the role or what we should expand or should invest in green hydrogen / ammonia as future energy.
Great, thank you. And Cornelius, building off of that, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on what you see are some of the key challenges that need to be addressed when it comes to scaling green hydrogen production and scaling these technologies that exist but that are still burgeoning. And how do you think that these challenges to scaling could be overcome for the region?
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, and also for having me. That's a good question. Well, we started 14 years ago with energy transition in the region, solar, wind, which was pretty exotic. Then actually maybe 7 years ago on hydrogen as well, exotic. And what happened over the last 2 to 3 years is really amazing. It's breathtaking. It's a sort of revolution. You can say that energy transition with green molecules, or better zero emission molecules, low emission molecules, merges, let's say, all different sectors, the power sector with the big industrial consumers, even heating and cooling. So I think that's a big driver, with obviously the lowest cost electricity, the best resources for solar and wind on Earth at the lowest price, which is new currency. Now, scaling this up, obviously, we are just at the very start. We've seen what NEOM Green Hydrogen has gone through, development phase and now financial close. I think this is a very good, let's say, case study now. Obviously, out of the 59 projects announced, which we are tracking here in the region, we have a few very concrete ones, but most of them are actually in earlier stage. So it is about scaling up electrolyzers. It is about the fact that more countries need to come out with hydrogen strategies. It is about creating all the conditions to make projects bankable. Most of all, off-takers. Off-takers, the most important thing. But then again, off-takers, for example, in Europe, they're waiting for other conditions. So I think that's the biggest challenges here. And I don't have any doubt that seeing this dynamic development over the last 2 to 3 years, and what happens as well in countries like Oman, for example, which is quite impressive, that we will see even more dynamic next 2 to 3 years and a decade full of exciting developments and disruption here.
Thank you. And Martin, I wanted to bring you into the conversation as well. As scaling scales up, as scaling develops, what do you see are some of the promising case studies and some of the promising use cases for green hydrogen? Do you think that there are specific industries or sectors that could become early adopters of hydrogen solutions?
Yes, thanks for the question, and thanks again for having me on the podcast. I mean, I think it's a good question to start at that demand end, because I think too often we start at the supply end and people think about how they can make low carbon hydrogen, whereas actually that supply chain perspective is far more important, because who's going to use it at scale? And I think there's a pretty easy answer in the short term, because the IEA tell us that we use about 90 million tons a year of hydrogen globally already, and that's predominantly grey hydrogen emitting lots of CO2. So a great place to start is decarbonising that existing hydrogen. So that's in oil refining, petrochemicals, making ammonia fertilizer. So there's a huge challenge already just to make enough low carbon hydrogen to decarbonize those sectors. And we can kind of worry about future things beyond that. We don't need lots of sort of a new technology for using hydrogen, just let's decarbonize the starting point. But the other one to mention that I think is steel as well, where decarbonizing steel is a huge challenge for the world. And there aren't many options for reducing iron ore other than using coal, which we want to stop doing, and so using hydrogen instead. So I think with that short list, there's plenty to talk about in terms of using out the hydrogen we can make in the near term.
Thank you. And of course, there are hard to abate sectors, and even just thinking about the renewables landscape and the role for hydrogen, it's only part of a greater discussion around energy at large. And Dr. Faras, I wanted to ask you how do you see the green hydrogen industry in the region fitting into this broader context of the global energy landscape, and especially when it comes to considerations around energy security and global climate action?
Fantastic. Thank you, Thomas, for the question and for the invite. So I think my colleagues, the speakers have already set the ground for where it really makes a viable business proposition for the Middle East, and looking at how they can fit into the energy or the green hydrogen hub scenarios. So if we look at what is required over here from the Middle East perspective, we have a great potential for creating the supply, and then we need to look at the industrialization, the consumption that we have. And if we look at Oman specifically, where we have around 1 million tons of hydrogen being consumed, a large portion of that goes for the petrochems and the refining aspects. Now, is there a significant push today to decarbonize these elements? We need to look at that. There are the hard to abate sectors, and then we need to look at our industrialization. So which of these map into the hard to abate sectors? And then more importantly, from our perspective, as we look at economic growth and diversification of revenues, can we attract some of these hard to abate sectors into the region? Can we become hubs for these new sectors? So steel was mentioned, perhaps a precursor of that, if it makes sense. Green iron rather than green steel itself is something that could be looked into. We are geographically placed between the east and the west, so there's also mobility that wasn't mentioned, but mobility could be an option, and here we're talking about heavy mobility. So the multiple aspects that we had as the Middle East could look towards playing a role and supplying both the avenues of the energy vector that the world looks for, the decarbonized ones, but also attracting economic growth for our own. So not just to act as suppliers of a energy carrier, but also bringing some of the industry to the region itself.
Great, thank you. And Martin, I wanted to get your take on that because, as it was mentioned, a lot of different factors can drive the conversation. It can be partially demand driven. It can depend on hard to abate sectors and their incorporation. Momentum is uneven throughout the world, and different regions are now starting to think and trying to capture a market share of this burgeoning hydrogen market. And as an example, at COP27, the UAE's Masdar reported that Africa could capture up to 10% of the green hydrogen market by 2050. The UAE energy minister has said that the UAE aims to capture 25% of the hydrogen market much sooner, by 2030, so in less than 10 years. What steps do you think regional stakeholders should leverage now that we're in 2023 to set the foundations to become successful hydrogen exporters and grab this market share to their advantage?
I think an important point actually is that hydrogen is actually inherently a local affair. In terms of what happens today, most hydrogen is made and used. There's a few pipelines, particularly in the US, some in Europe, but as far as possible, hydrogen is best used locally. And then because transporting it is quite expensive still, and technology needs to evolve further to do that. So I think really for Middle East and Africa to kickstart the development, it's not just looking for exports, it's also looking to do stuff at home as well. So decarbonizing refineries in the region, and then as you build up the supply infrastructure, then you can add on some export infrastructure as well. In fact, you even see in Africa, for example, I think there are deals to be done where you could get a developed country, a European investor, say, to put money into renewable power in North Africa and combine that with some domestic decarbonisation and then some hydrogen supply export for Europe. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the local perspective. So start local and then build global supply chains out from that. So that's probably a good place to start, I'd say.
Understood. And Francois, building off that point where the emphasis is potentially on the local markets as opposed to international trade when it comes to hydrogen, different market players have different starting points on the hydrogen road. And it was mentioned earlier, there's hard to abate industry sectors like industrial processing, like steel, like transport. And those are, because they are described as hard to abate, they're sometimes said to be laggards. What do you think are some specific challenges for these hard to abate sectors over other industries? And what do you think is on the horizon in terms of ideas for overcoming those challenges?
Well, the point is that everything is challenging. Okay, we talk about green hydrogen, but actually we should talk about ammonia as well. So let's pair it word by word. The green one, for us, of course, is our core expertise is to develop large wind and solar PV plant, and this is what we are doing, running around these countries, North Africa, meaning Morocco, Egypt, as well as I think most of the Middle East country from Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Oman, of course, where we are trying to find land to study them, environmentally speaking, as well as resources, put metmass. All this is what we call the greenfield development that would take some time, sometimes years, for any project to start. Of course, hydrogen itself is challenging. Cornelius has mentioned electrolyzer, large gigawatt of electrolyzer will be needed. So this, I'm sure that the industries around the world are working hard on this. We see Chinese, we see Western, European, as well as American. They are coming, that's perfect. Then ammonia, and ammonia is linked to the fact that, and Martin has rightly mentioned, whether it's for domestic use or for export. That's the challenging question, because it depends on the offtake, of course. So I must say that from our view, for the moment, is more for export at first stage, initially, and then definitely, no doubt about it, domestically, there will be local use. But to me, it will come either parallel or at a second phase. So yes, international or trading will be, or trading or power generation for instance, in Korea and Japan will be a major target. And we are, as utility companies, are discussing, actually developing as well, start developing next generation of ammonia/hydrogen turbine, which will be needed. Yes, these are the major off-takers that we are discussing with. And all these green hydrogen/ammonia projects will need to be huge because the demand is huge. So Dr. Firas, he has not mentioned, but you may know that the Hydrom tender is for 320 square kilometers, which, sorry about my reference, is 3 times Paris City. So this is what we are talking about. I'm very grateful that the Sultanate has allocated such an area, because this is what we need, is the land to start with. And of course, we are working on this particular project, at least to be ready to meet or to try to build solutions to meet these challenges.
That's a very interesting point, because as you mentioned, it's not just hydrogen. There's ammonia, there's different strategies that organizations can take, whether looking in country, looking externally. And Cornelius, I'm curious your take on that, because organizations looking towards clean energy solutions in general have a variety of paths at their disposal. As has been mentioned, they can focus on developing a roadmap, they can focus on establishing pipeline transport pilots, or fundraising and attaining the financing that's necessary, or scaling existing technologies like we mentioned, among others. And I'm curious, what would you tell an organization that's unsure of the direction that it should take with its limited time and resources?
Yeah, it's a good question, Thomas. It always comes up on how to transport. So I think, first of all, coming back to local markets versus exports, local markets are always underestimated. So in countries like Oman, there's a massive potential to use actually record low cost wind, solar, to reindustrialize, to attract industries, like has been announced in December, with Jindal Steel, a DRI plant in Duqm. Same in Morocco. And these kind of countries, which is importing 2 million tons of ammonia per year, which can easily be greened at a lower cost. So I think the local use in different applications, including, of course, mobility, like here in the UAE, for example, where we saw just the day before yesterday an announcement on a mobility pilot. I think this shouldn't be underestimated. And well, the use, of course, dictates, first of all, the form of the molecule. The good thing on low emission molecules versus electricity is that you can transport terawatt hours. You know, in a pipeline, you can transport 10 times more than in an HVDC cable. You can store seasonally. So, you know, this is really the beauty. And I think all of this, I think the good news is that we have so many different possibilities to convert to other forms of green molecules. But where we will go, I think nobody can tell in this decade. Majority of the projects, obviously, they are on ammonia, which is, you know, the vector of, let's say, transport. Not even talking about cleaning up the ammonia production, which is half of hydrogen's global use, which can easily be and must be cleaned up, of course. It's almost all gray ammonia. But yeah, ammonia has 100 ammonia ships. It has import-export terminals, storage capabilities, transport even by ships, you know, lorries. So this is all for ammonia. Liquid hydrogen is for the 30s. That's not for this decade. Liquid organic hydrogen carriers might have a role. We don't know yet. But don't forget about things like e-fuels. E-fuels, they are an important thing as well here for the region, talking about synthetic kerosene, for example. So it's an interesting field with a lot of flexibility, but I think completely unclear development. Look at, maybe to mention two more things, ammonia and methanol as a shipping fuel. There will be a race between low emission ammonia and low emission methanol for shipping. Ammonia engines for ships will be available from next year. And maybe a last point from the region here, that's an initiative we launched, the Eastern Mediterranean Hydrogen Pipeline, together with the Hydrogen Council of the German government. So pipelines, they are already there in the Mediterranean, but they will play a key role, particularly from the region here, to supply Europe as the lowest cost and, you know, the most immediate means in transporting hydrogen.
Interesting. And Dr. Faras, I'm curious your take on that as well, because it sounds like there are many different paths. There are the technological considerations of what to focus on right now, what to focus on next year, what to focus on in the 2030s. There's the corporate strategy considerations that could respond or preempt the direction of the market. And then, of course, there's the international context. And in particular, in 2022, we saw this shift back and forth between energy security and energy transition. So with all of these things happening the past year at the same time, I'm curious if you think that there's anything that these industry players could pay more attention to at this particular point in time, in this particular junction, as we approach the midway of 2023.
It's a very interesting question, Thomas, particularly when it requires you to have a crystal ball. It's a difficult question, to be honest, and I think it's reflected in the auction process we had. It's quite an open-ended question, and if you look at what we did at Hydrogen Oman Hydrom, is that we kept the end product quite open for the developers themselves to come in and to offer what they believe works, because it's linked to multiple externalities that neither we nor them control. So where does the world go with the debate between energy security versus energy transition? What's happening with the carbon credits and the taxes? Are they going to be implemented? Are they going to be implemented within the region where we're looking at exports or not? So there are different elements that really impact. And we kept it quite open-ended for the first round as a learning experience to see how things evolve with the bidders. What we did want is to cement a few ground rules, and those included sizing the plot on what we had as a market sounding makes sense for most developers. And that we took forward. We had ammonia as a energy vector and a likely output that would come. So we sized it where the economies of scale for the block and the end product of hydrogen, and then if it goes as a derivative ammonia works. But we also made it very clear that for us as Oman, we look forward, and this is the initial part of the discussion, the local use versus the international export. And then the third tangent that we want to focus on is onshoring the forward connected industries. So us being able to attract the hard to abate sectors. And that itself is challenging because now there are multiple moving parts. You're asking these developers not only to bet on hydrogen, but also to bet on moving parts of the supply chain. We believe that actually makes sense from our perspective. This was not only the debate between energy security and energy transition that happened, but COVID and also the supply chain crisis that happened in the last 2 years also showed the fragility and the vulnerability of the supply chains. And then diversifying the locations of your supply chain makes sense. And we believe the Middle East is understated in the supply chain configuration. So we're trying to articulate and convince the world that we have the cheap resources for renewables. Hydrogen is today still quite local, but it has an export potential. Let's merge the two and have some of the end products happen over here and move forward. And that is what we're trying to do. So to try and answer your question, which is a difficult one, what we're also trying to articulate now is to look at whether subsequent rounds need to be sector related in localized sectors rather than keeping it open. And it's still early stages. We want to first go fully through the first round of auctions, which hopefully will be concluding with an award by the end of April. And the learning process with the different developers that we're interacting with has been extremely rich from our perspective. And it brings maturity both on the supply and demand conversation. And with that, we can come up with mutually beneficial solutions, both for the parties involved and the world from a decarbonization perspective.
Thank you. And Mohammed, I wanted to bring you into the conversation and ask for your take, because granted, no one has a crystal ball and you can't predict the future. But I was curious how you see the industry evolving over the next few years in the region, and if you've seen any trends or if you consider any factors to be more important in driving this evolution in the next couple of years.
Thank you, Thomas, for the question. We have all the hydrogen experts here. So from my point of view and from, let's say, Microsoft experience, back in July 2022, right, we successfully ran a 48 hours backup energy system for one of our main data centers purely on hydrogen fuel cells. So we pledged to run all of our data centers globally by 2025 on clean energy, but that still had the problem of diesel generators, and that was successfully replaced in a trial by hydrogen fuel cells. So it's definitely promising and expands, across industries, across mobility, here across data centers and IT. And I also see that the role that technology plays, for example, to make the hydrogen as a resilient power supply from forecasting the supply chain and supply chain optimization using AI. So it can optimize the production, storage, distribution of hydrogen, and AI can analyze data on demand, weather patterns, and other factors to optimize the production and distribution of hydrogen. So from our side as well, there is many steps, to ensure that the industry can scale and can be reliable. Digital twins is another example. And by creating a digital twin of a hydrogen plant, operators can use AI to simulate different operating scenarios and optimize the hydrogen plant's performance. So definitely by having a partnership between, the end user, the government, the technology providers, and the hydrogen producers will definitely scale and advance the industry in the right direction.
Absolutely. And Francois, as we think about these potentially competing priorities, an emphasis on local markets, on scaling technologies, on partnerships, we've also seen that buy-in for the potential use of hydrogen of ammonia production has increased, and the market is developing, and there are more opportunities that are being realized. But we still have these hard to abate sectors that we mentioned previously, and there is the challenge of advancing towards these green energy solutions. They can be particularly daunting for companies that operate under the fossil fuels model, but are nevertheless looking to start to incorporate these clean energy solutions into their product suite. In particular, with these fossil fuel companies that are looking to set the foundations for incorporating hydrogen into their expertise and into their product suite, are there any recommendations that you have for these companies that have built their entire models on fossil fuels?
Okay, so of course we are green electricity supplier. So for us, we understand and major of our customers have to seriously look at their scope 1 as well as scope 3 carbon footprint, for sure. And I think the best answer I can give is our current joint venture that we have with a large mining group called Anglo American, that you all know, with whom we have an agreement to help to support them to reach net zero carbon by 2030 in all their mining activities in South Africa and nearby countries by 2030. So we are talking about 3 gigawatts of renewable energies to be deployed and then feeding all their mining activities in this, I think it's something like 10 or 15 sites, mining sites. So definitely, this is what will reduce significantly their consumption of diesel, actually, that they are running, or the grid electricity, as you may know, in South Africa is largely from coal power plant. So this is huge volume of CO2 which will be abated. Another, and it's also in line with what we are working or thinking or trying to develop it with Anglo American, is the steel sector. Green steel plant do have the technology to be carbon free. Of course, it starts from the mining. This is what we are trying to do with Anglo American. And now, yes, we're in discussion with various green steel professional industries in order to develop the brand new green steel plant to be fed by hydrogen and then to be fully CO2 free steel. And of course, you can imagine that the whole thing go down to the final off-taker could be, by the way, wind power turbine supplier, as well as automobiles, which are the large user of steel. These are the whole cycle which we have to look at. And then last but not least is the financing. All our projects and the business model, as you know, is based on private investment. So that means that we need to mobilize not only our own equity, but as well as lenders from various banks. And this is where we need to select the most bankable projects within the most bankable countries. And of course, along with the most bankable off-takers, to make at least the first projects to start rolling. And then I'm sure, and this is what I hear and then hear every day now, is that, yes, we need to make the ball rolling. And then I'm sure that we'll keep on going.
It's a very interesting point when you think about bankable projects, right? Particularly making them bankable, the potential for joint ventures that involve international players at the international level. And Martin, I was curious to get your take on that as well, because the business model for hydrogen can differ sometimes between regions around the world based on factors like energy resources, market demand, existing infrastructure, government policies. And I wanted to ask, would you say that the business model for hydrogen is different in any way in the Middle East and Africa compared to other regions around the world, or is it pretty much standardized?
I think maybe if I can tie the answer to that and the question you asked Francois, I was going to jump in and make comment on that as well, because you're asking about fossil fuel companies and and what they can do to transition. And I think that fits with your business model question as well, because I think even though it's moving away from fossil fuels to renewable solutions, one of the key skills of fossil fuel companies is putting together integrated supply chains. So I spent much of my career working for Shell in the LNG business. And in LNG, that was all about that linkage between production, transport in the middle, and offtake in whatever way that happened. And that sort of basic business model, I think, will still apply in the decarbonised world for hydrogen and its derivatives as well. So one of my colleagues at the Ulster Institute recently published a paper. His background was from a merchant bank financing LNG projects, and his take was that for getting low carbon hydrogen and ammonia happening at scale, we need to draw lessons from the LNG business and offshore wind, kind of combine the two. And it's all about sharing out risks along the value chain, about establishing confidence in the revenue stream that's going to come. And then whether it's funded by lenders or by equity from big companies, then if you put a chain together that is kind of robust, then you've got something that can work. And that's, I think, the challenge we've been struggling with, because the additional feature around low carbon hydrogen and ammonia is you need governments involved in that process too. But then that's not so new. I mean, so back in the early days of LNG, like the government of Japan had to be involved in supporting that process. So I think that skill around build a robust creditworthy supply chain, that's the key to success, I'd say.
And Dr. Faras, sorry, please.
Sorry, just to allow me to add another challenge that we used to work in different worlds between electrical companies and chemical company. And this is where we need to make molecule, electricity, electron, all these people, lenders, all work together. And that's the big challenge. And as rightly mentioned, Martin, that's very new to all of us. So we need to learn, and we need to definitely go forward as it is.
Yeah, it's about integration across the system, that's for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. It sounds like it's, it's a collaborative, collective effort that requires a multifaceted approach. And luckily, sometimes it sounds like there's already a lot of enthusiasm in the region for embracing hydrogen and looking down that road. For example, Saudi Arabia declared its intention to become a clean hydrogen hub. Oman plans to build the world's largest hydrogen plant. The UAE has professed hydrogen as an integral market in its energy outlook. And Dr. Faras, I wanted to ask you, how do you think evolving policies will impact the net zero roadmap of the region, of these countries, and of private sector stakeholders in the Middle East and in Africa?
So policy will certainly play a great role, particularly in the Middle East, where we have been late in general. If you look at the announcements and adherence to whether it is the Paris Accord or the subsequent COPs, we've been a little bit late coming as nations in the Middle East and Africa towards decarbonization targets and having policies. And that is pretty much tied to the industrialization history of the different nations. So countries that had greater industrialization, and then those who are also impacted by energy security, have an additional incentive to try and diversify their energy supplies. So coming back to the Middle East, I think our policies might differ from nations where they have an equilibrium of supply potential and demand requirements. And if you take the US, for example, where it's a huge market for both hydrogen and has a huge potential for galvanizing the supply, and that's what they did with the IRA. The EU did something similar, actually multiple steps. One, they created the carbon border adjustment mechanism to help galvanize their industry and protect it, because they're quite mature when it comes to the decarbonization policy. And then they want, as an economic bloc, wants to set a mechanism to protect its industries and force external players to adhere with their rules of the game. So you already have these large economic blocks that have set trends. And then given that we're in a global world and the economies are intertwined with each other, that now puts an onus on us to decide how we want to address them. So you gave examples of nations who are making bold moves and saying, yes, we want to be part of the train and move ahead. And it's very important to take these ambitions and translate them into executable strategies. And so it's one thing to announce, and it's another to actually move forward and execute. So I think it's really important to balance out and look at sustainable development scenarios where you're really looking at your economy and what needs to be decarbonized there. What are the benefits of doing that versus the detriments of moving in certain sectors? So you need to prioritize which sectors you need to decarbonize and using which tools. So you have many tools, whether it's energy efficiency, clean energy, or tools that are targeted towards hard to abate sectors such as green hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen. So I think articulating these strategies in a cohesive manner is important. I think it's a very regional discussion as well on multiple fronts. So when we are more oriented in Oman, for example, towards export or importing industries, because the two balance out, and then we have other nations who are more importers of energy vectors, we need to look at how we can collaborate with each other. And that is something that we need to reflect in our policies, so bilaterals or relationships. I think another aspect, another facet of policy making is looking at it from regional blocks. The reason the EU was able to do what it has been doing, although it comes with its own bureaucracy and deliberation, the fact of the matter, it is a large economic bloc where it can set trends. And I think that is something we should have more of in the Middle East and Africa. So we need to have more regional discussions on what we want to do. So yes, it is a competition between nations, but it's also a competition between economic blocs. And I think as Middle East and Africa, we need to also grow into looking at it from a regional perspective and finding the cooperation avenues we want to ensure that there's maximal benefit for us as a region, as nations, and then as a globe as well.
Absolutely, thank you. And Mohammed, as we wrap up the podcast, I wanted to give you the final word, and I wanted to ask you one final question that touches on several points that have been mentioned so far throughout the conversation, and that's partnerships, and this not only from the competition that Dr. Faras was just mentioning, but the potential for collaborative work. And partnerships are often touted as a way to advance sustainability initiatives in general. And when it comes to clean energy, I wanted to ask what role you think and your vision for partnerships and collaboration, the role that they can play in the growth of the hydrogen industry in the Middle East and Africa.
Thanks, Thomas. And I think the team here has summarized it all, right? So, but fostering international partnerships is crucial for the clean hydrogen industry. It will require international partners, governments, industries, research institutions working together to share knowledge, expertise, and resources. We need the government as well to, encourage investment in clean hydrogen. Private, public sector should work together. Incentives for the investment, such as tax breaks, subsidies, favorable regulations for the hydrogen producers. The industry from to create the domestic and export markets, technology providers such as Microsoft, the Honeywell, the Siemens, as well to collaborate for more resilient and safe, let's say, production and transport of hydrogen. I think it's crucial. There is no success in one player. There is no one player who can do end-to-end the value chain of hydrogen. Definitely, it takes everyone to create that value chain and ensure it's a clean hydrogen for with minimum emissions.
Definitely. So it's an all hands on deck approach, and we'll have to wrap it up there. But thank you so much. Our time together has come to an end. We've had an insightful and interesting discussion about the region's potential to become a global hydrogen hub and how that endeavor goes hand in hand with building a more sustainable future. So we've heard some questions, we've gotten some answers, and we'll continue to get answers as the podcast series progresses. I'd like to thank our guests for being on this edition of the Microsoft Middle East and Africa Forum for Sustainability Leaders. Francois Dow, Dr. Faras Al Abdouani, Cornelius Mattis, Martin Lambert, and our host, Mohammed Hassan. Thank you very much, and please join us again in the future.